In Wish 3.6.01, we changed the way we referenced or made reference to files or documents that were stored externally to Wish. What you're looking at here is the screen for the Attachments tab on the client workbook in the prior versions of Wish. And this was the way that we had always referred to these documents. So we called them attachments. And you could see up in this field here, you would reference the attachment and add it with the plus sign, and it would now appear in this table. This was the exact same between the client workbook, and also the same thing appeared on the child's workbook where they had an attachments tab and it looked exactly the same. So we changed that in version 3.6.01. We added quite a bit of enhancement to this tab. And it starts first of all with the change in name. So we changed it from attachments, and I'm just going to toggle over to the way it now appears. So this is the same tab in the new version of Wish. You've noticed that we've renamed it External Documents, which is more appropriate to what it actually was rather than attachments. And it too is exactly the same now on the child's workbook. So we won't go into that. We'll just look at it or demonstrate it here on the client workbook because it's exactly the same. Now the idea was on the other one, on the prior versions, what you would do is you would reference a document that is stored externally somewhere in your server. And it would simply point at the file, so the file had to exist. So we still allow you to do that. We've just modified the naming convention a little bit, so we call that a link, and that's exactly what you see here where it says it's a link to this document that is stored in this folder. Once again, I'm going to toggle back to the old one. That's how it appeared on the old one, and now on the new one, that exact same link would look like this. You'll notice also the color. So you can still do links like that as you would in the other one, though the process is slightly different. So now you would click on add a file, and if I wanted to reference a file in here, I could find a file that I wanted to add. So let's say I wanted to do a file, and I just made up a test one in here. Made up a test one in this screen. Well, it doesn't matter what I pick. I can pick anything here. Morning Glory Muffins. That's a lovely thing to reference. So this could be a PDF file or a document that's written on behalf of your client, or maybe you've received the document from another agency that is also serving the client. And so once you reference that file here, this option, link to an external file, would be the exact same way that it was done under the prior one. So that would mean that that file had to always exist in that location, and if somebody had moved it or deleted it, you wouldn't be able to open it. Now the difference in this version is we've given the option, instead of just pointing at it, you could actually move that document right into Wish into what we call a file repository. And we've given you 3 repositories. They're exactly all the same. It's just that there is a space limitation on that of 2 gigabytes per repository. So we're starting off, we're going to give you 3 repositories. So that's quite a bit of storage space. If somehow that becomes an issue or we need to add more repositories, we can easily do that in a future build. But as for now, your choices are link to the file or move it to a repository. If you choose to move it to a repository, you can do that in any of these 3. The other thing that you need to know is down here at the bottom, we give you the status of each of your repositories. So if they were starting to fill up, you will get notifications down here in this bottom part, because there is, as I say, a size limitation. It's quite a large size limitation, but anticipate that eventually you could actually fill those up. In any regard, the other difference is now when you want to add a file into the repository or even link to it, you have to now provide a description of what that file is. So, I mean, if this was a letter from a doctor or a lawyer, or a letter that you wrote on behalf of the client, you could fill it in here. Strangely enough, this is a recipe for Morning Glory Muffins. Not that you'd ever put that onto a client's file, but if you chose to do that, you would type what that is and say, this is a very tasty recipe. Okay. Once again, you would never put a recipe onto a client's file, but that's all I have to show you today. At any rate, once you pick the file and put a description and choose how you're going to store it, either by linking it to an external file or moving it to a repository, and I'll just use repository in this case. You click on this button here to add the file to the record. And when you do, you notice it tells you that it's been added. Now, when you choose a repository as opposed to linking to an external file, you see when I click OK, I'm going to get an additional question. And that question here is, do I want to delete that original file? And if I say yes, then that file will no longer exist. It will be erased from your hard drive because it's stored internally in Wish. I could also say no and just leave that file there. And in this case, I'm going to say no because, you know, geez, I might need that recipe. At any rate, here we are now. You can see where that has been added onto this second row. You notice a color difference. So repositories are marked in a light green. External links are marked in yellow. So if I were to do another file here really quickly, I'll just pick anything. Doesn't really matter what I pick. I'm just going to pick this thing here, and I can type what this is. So this is a test, and I can move that to any file repository as well. So I'll just add that one. And this is a little bit bigger file, so it's taking a little bit longer to add. And when it's done, it's going to ask me if I want to delete it. Yeah, I should have maybe picked a much smaller file, but of course I didn't. And now it's going to ask me, and I'm going to say yes, I want to delete it. So in that case, it's deleted it off of the server, but it exists within Wish again as a repository, so you can see the visual difference. Now the other thing that you can do in here is you'll notice on this right-hand side of the table that there's three little icons. The first one is if you want to retrieve or open the file. So if it's a link, it will simply open the file if it exists at that location. And just going back to the older version of Wish, that would be the same as clicking on Open This File button. When you're talking about a repository, this one here, which is retrieve the file, actually has to pull it out of the repository and make a new temporary file somewhere on your computer system. So if I was to do that, and I clicked on that button, you'll see it pops up with a screen, and it basically wants to know two things. It knows what file it's going to retrieve, but it wants to know a reason why I'm retrieving it. Okay, so this is a really tasty recipe, so I'm going to say because I'm hungry. Oops. And then you have to tell it where you want it to save that file. So if I was to say I want to save it in my documents, that's where it's going to save it to. Oops, here we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So once I've got that selected, I can choose to open the file. And when it's pulling it out of the repository, it will make a brand new file in this location. And you'll see that right here. So now it's created a new file with this file name in that documents folder. And it asks if I want to open it. And if I say yes, it's going to pop open that file. Now, it doesn't remove it from the repository. That file still exists in that repository, but now it's made a second file in this folder here, and I can choose to keep that file or delete it or print it or do whatever I want. But in any event, you may recall that it did ask me why I was choosing to retrieve it, so I had to type a reason in here. Now that whole thing about typing what's in the file and why you want to retrieve it is actually tracked. So you'll notice that this middle icon over here in these three icons on the right hand side will allow you to display information about that file. So if I click on that, what you'll see is it will pop up a file information. So I've got a description, and that was the description I originally typed in, where the file came from originally, the name of that file. And if I go to the history here, you will notice it keeps track of the date and time. You see down here the time that it was added to the file and who did that. And also, if it was ever retrieved, it would track who retrieved it, the time they did, and why they felt that they needed to retrieve that. So that's really useful tracking information for your files. Another thing to be aware of, if you've got a client or a worker blocked from a from a client's workbook, they also can now not access the files in the repository. So it's an additional security step for you when you're blocking clients, workers from certain client files. A couple more things to show you. If I take this one and I realize, oops, I shouldn't have put that there, I made a mistake, I can delete that from the repository. So I can just click on this button here, the red X, and when I do, again, you might notice that it needs a reason. I have to put a reason in. I can't leave it blank. So I'm going to put placed on wrong client's file. And now when I click on the delete button, it actually removes that out of the repository. And so it's going to take a few minutes because that was quite a large file I chose to save in there. But you'll notice when it's gone, it disappears off of their table. However, at any point, I can select this button here, and I can see that there was a file that was deleted at this spot, at this point here. Furthermore, I can still go and click on the information and get the history of that. So if I go to the history, I can see down here who deleted the file and why they deleted it, and also when they did that. So great audit records around here tracked. Furthermore, all of these additions and all that stuff is tracked as audit records connected to both the client and also the counselor who's working with them. One last thing to show you, because you may have files that you've been using currently that are links. And if I go into the information of this one, which was an existing one prior to the update, you might notice in here that there may not be any history in here. Notice there's no history in that table or description because in the prior version I wish you didn't type that. Now an interesting thing, if you want to one by one move these to the repository, do you notice I've got a button down here that says move to repository. So now I can go and actively individually one by one select those old links and choose to move it to the repository. So when I do this, you'll notice it will come up here, and now I'm going to need a description of what's in that file. This is a test file, and you notice down here I can choose to move it to any of the repositories that I have, and if I choose to do that, I can now delete that original file. In this case, I'm going to say no. But you notice when I come back here and refresh that screen, how it's now moved to the repository. It's no longer marked as a link. Again, the audit trails for that file now show that the file was moved to the repository on this date and time. Anyway, that's a new feature for external documents, which were previously referred to as attachments. It's the exact same tab on the child's workbook, so you will have no problem going between the two and understanding that. If you understand one, you've got the two. Anyway, I hope you found this video helpful, and we're looking forward to getting this out to you first week in July. Thanks.